All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next part. This is really interesting and potentially earth-shattering in terms of its impact on American society. Let's put this up there on the screen. So the Supreme Court, the conservative majority there, signaling major skepticism of race-conscious college admissions. So what happened yesterday, which is that at issue are these two policies, Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, that permit their admissions offices to weigh the race of applicants as one of many factors that will help decide who is being accepted. Depending on the scope of the court's ruling, and this is important, they could rule in many different ways. The outcome could have impact on workplace and other long-standing, quote, anti-discrimination law. And I want to be very clear, which is that how exactly they rule and the scope through which could restrict it completely to admissions. This is why we're even spending any time covering it. Or it could go all the way out into the way that diversity practices work, even at a quote unquote private company. Anyway, so there were over 5 hours of arguments. I was even considering doing a monologue, but the arguments weren't wrapping up. And I was like, I can't do it without, I was like, I can't do a whole monologue on this until it's actually done. Luckily, it ended last night. What we effectively noted is that the conservatives on the bench were talking about the 2003 precedent that does permit the use of race in college admissions that had urged policies should not be in place indefinitely. So what we should remember is that in that 2003 case, effectively the court was like, okay, you can keep in mind race. You cannot use points-based admissions. That's just not on the table. But to say that you can't keep it in mind at all is not going to happen. That said, you need to come up with a system so that you don't rely on this indefinitely.
Yeah.
And what I found really interesting in the court and a lot of the arguments that I was looking at is that none of the universities, neither Harvard nor the University of North Carolina, could actually spell out a time frame as to when it was going to be appropriate or not.
Yeah, but
I feel like
go
ahead.
That's kind of fair.
No,
Because that's like being like, on this date in 2032, we will have total racial justice. We'll have solved racism. So, I mean, it's kind of fair to be like, I don't know, we're not there yet, but hopefully at some point in the future we get to that.
I don't even disagree, but I was looking at it and I was like, that just part to me makes the whole like idea of the 03 case being like, yeah, but it eventually has to end just even more patently ridiculous because you could probably always make an argument. So like, okay, so then we should consider it on what is the actual impact. This goes to the Harvard University portion of which we've covered now for several years, which is that Harvard from the lawsuit and the court rulings and all that have come out, it has been shown repeatedly that it is highly discriminatory against Asian American students by giving them lower scores for, quote, personal attributes.
I mean, some of the stuff that came out.
Yeah. It's outrageous.
I don't think there's any denying that whatever you think of affirmative action, that the current system has discriminated against Asian Americans in a very perverse way.
Right. And because they'll be like, well, they literally can show that you can have the same test scores, you can have the same basically attributes on every single thing. And then on the personal section, they're getting rated dramatically lower.
It's all these very like racist tropes of like, doesn't show leadership
not
qualities.
Social.
It's like, oh, this is bad. This is really bad.
Anyway, so the point is that in that 2003 case, they set that 25-year timeline, but they didn't necessarily cap themselves on when race-conscious admissions were coming up. This, of course, would take place 2022 and is based really on both anti-discrimination practices as in the way that affirmative action is being used against Asian Americans, but also just in general on the idea of race consciousness. And the reason I thought it was important is not only in terms of the scope of American society, but really politically. This is one of the great disconnects, and Krystal, you did a fantastic monologue on this a while back over at Rising, between really elites and the rest of the public. Affirmative action is perhaps one of the most single unpopular positions that exists in the United States, was defeated in the state of California on a ballot level in 2020. And yet, you have the Biden administration that went to bat for it, actually, at the court. The U.S. Solicitor General saying that it was a national security imperative to keep it. Let's take a listen.
That truth is vitally important to our nation's military. Our armed forces know from hard experience that when we do not have a diverse officer corps that is broadly reflective of a diverse fighting force, our strength and cohesion and military readiness suffer. So it is a critical national security imperative to attain diversity within the officer corps. And at present, it's not possible to achieve that diversity without race-conscious admissions, including at the nation's service academies. The military experience confirms what this court recognized in Grutter, that in a society where race unfortunately still matters in countless ways, achieving diversity can sometimes require conscious acts by our leading educational institutions.
So that was the U.S. Solicitor General, effectively like the chief litigator on behalf of the United States, making it, of course, in the purview of what they have, which is the U.S. service academies. Because, as we said, if it does impact higher education, even at a private university like Harvard, it would, of course, also apply to the service academies. Let's consider it, though, in the public context. Put this up there on the screen. Most Americans actually say that colleges and universities should not consider applicants' race in order to further student body diversity in education. So U.S. adult citizens, 23% yes, 23% not sure. A majority, 54%, say no. Even amongst Democrats, Krystal, only 40% say yes. 26% say not sure. 34% say no. Independents, 17% yes, 28% not sure, 55% no. Republicans, overwhelming majority, say no. I also think it's important to note, if you ask Black Americans, only 36% say yes, 33% say not sure, and 32% say no. The same fits with quote-unquote Hispanic, whatever that means. And then amongst white Americans, 16% say yes, and 64% say no.
I would love to see the class breakdown.
Of course, and that's what I was about to get to.
I would love to see the class breakdown.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot to say about this because I think the reason why it's so unpopular is because it really rubs up against the notion that Americans want to strive for a colorblind society. And so there is this real rub there. I mean, the issue that I always have talking about affirmative action and why it's such sort of tricky ground for me personally is I sort of feel like I disagree with everyone on it. There's a lot of presumptions behind the policy and the debate on affirmative action that I just don't accept and don't agree with. The whole debate takes as fact the idea that we have a meritocracy, that the meritocracy is generally functioning, that the thing we should be striving for is to perfect that meritocracy, rather than, you know, my goal as a leftist, which is to make sure that everyone is able to succeed. I also think, like I said, Asian Americans are getting screwed by this policy. There's just no denying that. And I think that's something that people who are big proponents of this policy really have to grapple with and really have struggled to grapple with. That's number one. Number two, I don't agree with the arguments that are being put forth by the conservatives on the court, which is basically like, mission accomplished, colorblind society done, don't need this policy anymore. And we shouldn't pretend that the arguments that were being offered on the court, which is why I don't even spend a lot of time, like I read through the gist of what they were saying, but ultimately this is an ideological debate. It has very little to do with what their actual interpretation of the Constitution is. The 6 conservatives on the court, they don't like affirmative action. They're gonna find a way to strike it down, regardless of the arguments that are being made to them and whether they're persuaded on the constitutionality of it or whatever. And the liberals are, you know, on the other side. This is an ideological debate. The Supreme Court is partisan. We should keep all of that in mind as well. So those are some of my thoughts. But the other thing that I always come back to is like, what is your goal? What is your goal with this policy? If the only option on the table for me is let's diversify the elite class.
Which is what this is.
This policy is effective.
That's true.
And you know what? I would rather, if that is my only option, is have a non-diverse elite class, and I'm just talking about racial diversity here, or have a diverse, racially diverse elite class, then I will take the diverse elite class. Okay, if that's my only option on the table. However, if your goal is actually to reduce the racial wealth gap, we know from history, which is a goal that I personally care a lot more about than I care about the, you know, technical racial diversity of the elite class. We know from history that this policy does not do that. That in fact, the policies that have been most effective throughout our history to help to close the racial wealth gap, which we still have a very long way to go on, are universal policies that lift the floor for everyone. Things like lifting the minimum wage, things like making sure that Social Security and living wage benefits apply to across all job categories, and we don't carve out, you know, the job categories that are disproportionately filled by Black and brown people. So if that's your goal, and when you layer on top of that how much we know this policy is really unpopular, there's also a pragmatism here of like, We shouldn't assume that we can use our political capital to do absolutely everything. We should invest our political capital in the policies that are going to have the largest effect at achieving ultimately our goals. And I think we have one other piece from David Shore on the last element here.
Fascinating, actually.
That if you track, these are like all of the different sort of like Democratic aligned policies. Affirmative action is one of the least popular. So again, it has been beneficial primarily for middle and upper middle class minorities to, get into college and to ascend into the elite class. I don't think that's a bad thing. I do think diversity is an important value. But it goes back to the question of what are you really trying to accomplish and what are the policies that will most help you effectuate that goal that have broad public support. The last thing I will say on this, because I cannot leave this out, is that it is kind of a screwed up world where this gets struck down, but you still have legacy admissions, which are affirmative action for rich white people.
Well, actually,
and it's like disgraceful that is something that goes on and is so important, especially at our elite universities.
It's actually interesting that this could have an impact on legacy admissions as well. I want to concur with almost everything that you said. And I think one of the most impactful pieces that ever been had on me was written by the socialist Matt Bruenig about the racial wealth gap. And I think people should know this. The vast majority of the racial wealth gap in the United States is about the top 2 deciles of blacks and whites, as in, when everyone's like black wealth and white wealth, that's between the top 20% in both groups, as in the top 20% white people are much richer than the top 20% of rich black people. If you look at the median income of white earners and black earners, there is a gap, but it's not even close to what the gap is of what, we're looking at, which gets directly to your point, which is that, do you want a society where the NASDAQ remains the same, but there is a black person who's on the board of the directors? Or do you want a society where NASDAQ companies chase policies which are better for their workers and for the median American? And in general, my problem and why my politics are the way they are was coming to the Northeast and seeing the way that elite liberals talk about so many of these issues and realize, this is all just a game for all of you. As in, you want to protect whatever this little slice is and diversify this very small slice of the economy, the elite, the electorate, and not talk about anything that impacts any of the people I grew up with or even grew up around. It's they're used as pawns. And I think that generally is why I get so annoyed by it and why I like pointing to the political popularity. As you said, if you can't get affirmative action passed on the ballot in California, how are you going to defend it as the national law of the land, or at the very least as allowing it in some of our not just major institutions in government,
listen,
military,
for me,
all across the workplace.
The polling is not in and of itself determinative. I support other policies that don't poll well because I think they're the right policy, and you should be willing to argue for that. But when you couple that with the fact that this really doesn't, to me, help to deal with what should be the core goal, which is closing the racial wealth gap, and you're really antagonizing a majority of the public with this policy, then it gets to the question of, okay, is this really ultimately worth it? And I can imagine situations where, I'm generally a big supporter of universal policies, as you guys know, Medicare for all, living wage, unions for all. I think those are the best ways. And again, the track record bears it out to not only support the entire working class, but specifically those policies are most beneficial for Black and brown people who are disproportionately impoverished and in low wage jobs and, struggling at that end of the economy. So in general, I think those are the best policies. Can I imagine a policy that would be sort of specific to, to racial discrimination? 100%, absolutely. I don't think we should put that off the table whatsoever. But I do want to emphasize again, the part of this that, I really do chafe at from conservatives is their view is basically meritocracy, already good to go, no racial discrimination, everybody can compete, everybody can make it, so we don't need to do anything about this. And I don't agree with that either. I just think that we can aspire to more than diversifying our elite class, and ultimately that's, the thrust of my politics and where I like to spend my time.
I think we totally agree on that one.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.